This wasn't a myth. It wasn't underground. It was called Action Park, and people kept coming back. In the mountains of Vernon Township, New Jersey, there was once an amusement park where the rules felt optional. It opened in 1978. Its official name was Action Park, but for many who visited, it had another name: Class Action Park, Accident Park, Traction Park. The nicknames were jokes, mostly. From a distance, Action Park looked like a typical late 1970s summer attraction: water slides, go-karts, alpine rides, wave pools, teenagers in bright shirts, families on vacation. But what made Action Park different was not the rides themselves. It was the philosophy behind them. And before we dive in, hit that subscribe button because this story gets dark. The park was owned by a businessman who believed in risk. Not reckless risk, calculated risk, at least in theory. The idea was simple. Give people control. Let them drive their own ride. Let them regulate their own speed. Let them test their own limits. The problem was that most of the employees were teenagers, and so were many of the guests. The Alpine Slide became one of the park's signature attractions. It was a long concrete and fiberglass track that ran down a hillside. Riders sat in small wheeled carts. There were no seat belts, no track restraint, only a simple brake lever. Push forward to go faster. Pull back to slow down. That was it. The instructions were clear. Control your speed. But some riders didn't. Some underestimated the slope. Some lost control. Some flew off the track entirely. Friction burns became common. So common, in fact, that the park allegedly kept stacks of bandages near the ride exit. The Alpine Slide did not close. It remained operational for years. Then there was the wave pool. Officially, it was one of the largest in the country at the time. Unofficially, it had another name among staff and guests: the grave pool. The waves were powerful, stronger than many expected. Lifeguards were stationed around the perimeter. But the park's staffing culture was loose. Lifeguards were often young. Training standards were inconsistent. Over time, multiple drownings occurred in the wave pool. At least 3 deaths in the park's history were attributed to water-related incidents. Action Park's reputation began to spread. Teenagers came specifically because it felt unsupervised. There was alcohol, sometimes inside the park, sometimes before entry. Rules were present. Enforcement varied. One of the most infamous attractions was the Cannonball Loop. It was a water slide unlike anything else in the country. It featured a full vertical loop. Riders would slide down a steep enclosed tube, enter a circular loop, and exit at the bottom. The design sounded daring. In practice, it was unpredictable. Test dummies reportedly came out missing limbs. Some riders reportedly came out with bloody noses or minor injuries. Stories circulated about riders getting stuck at the top of the loop. There were rumors of teeth embedded in the padding. The Cannonball Loop did not last long. State regulators intervened. The ride was shut down within a month of opening, but the legend stayed. Another attraction involved small motorized boats in a pond. Guests could bump into each other freely. There was no track, no real supervision. Minor collisions were common. The go-karts were fast, faster than typical amusement park versions. Helmets were not always enforced consistently in early years. Crashes happened. The park also featured a Tarzan swing. Guests would swing from a rope over water and drop in. Some misjudged the timing. Some landed awkwardly. There were injuries. Broken bones were not rare at Action Park. They were part of the culture. For some visitors, that was the appeal. It felt like freedom. It felt like the 1980s distilled into one place. Unsupervised, loud, slightly dangerous. But freedom without oversight has limits. In 1980, a 19-year-old employee died from an electrical accident involving a kayak ride. In the early 1980s, several drownings occurred in the wave pool. In 1987, another fatal accident happened on a water slide. Each incident drew scrutiny. Each time, the park adjusted slightly, but it rarely transformed fundamentally. Lawsuits accumulated. Insurance premiums increased. Regulators began paying closer attention. By the mid-1980s, Action Park was known nationwide. Not for safety, for risk. News segments aired showing footage of chaotic crowds. Rumors grew beyond reality. Some stories were exaggerated, some were true, but the park leaned into its reputation. It became part of the brand. Visitors wore scars like souvenirs. The park remained profitable, despite injuries, despite lawsuits, despite criticism. Part of what made Action Park possible was location. It sat near the New York metropolitan area, accessible by car, close enough for day trips. Teenagers came in groups. Word of mouth spread. It wasn't Disney. It wasn't polished. It felt raw. But raw experiences don't age well under legal scrutiny. By the late 1980s, regulatory pressure increased. Injuries were harder to ignore. The business began to strain financially. In 1996, the original Action Park closed, but that was not the end. The site reopened under new names. Mountain Creek Water Park, different branding, updated safety standards, some original rides modified, some removed. But the shadow of Action Park remained. Documentaries were made. Former visitors shared stories. Former employees admitted that oversight had been loose, that teenage staff were sometimes responsible for serious safety roles, that some rides were tested more through use than engineering precision. In 2014, a brief attempt was made to revive the original name. Action Park returned, but not in its original form. The culture had changed. Regulations were stricter. Insurance markets were different. Public tolerance for risk had shifted. The revival did not last long. Today, the location operates as a more conventional water park. The Alpine Slide still exists in modified form, but the era of unchecked experimentation is over. What made Action Park unique was not just the rides, it was timing. It emerged in a period of looser regulation, before viral outrage cycles, before instant online documentation, before every accident became global news within minutes. Action Park lived in a moment when risk was sometimes mistaken for authenticity, where control was handed to guests without guardrails, where teenage employees learned on the job in real time. Some visitors remember it fondly. They describe it as thrilling, unfiltered, honest. Others remember it as irresponsible, poorly supervised, needlessly dangerous. Both can be true. The park did not set out to harm. It set out to innovate. But innovation without restraint can blur into hazard. Action Park became a cultural reference point, a symbol of excess, a reminder of what happens when adrenaline outweighs precaution. It is easy decades later to laugh at the stories, to exaggerate them, to mythologize them. But behind the jokes were real injuries, real lawsuits, real families affected by fatal accidents, and real changes to how amusement parks are regulated today. Modern theme parks are meticulously engineered, risk assessments are detailed, insurance requirements are strict, emergency protocols are standardized. Much of that evolution came from places like Action Park. It became an example, not just of danger, but of transition. The end of an era when experimentation outpaced oversight. Today, when people talk about Action Park, they rarely describe it quietly. They describe it with energy, with disbelief, with nostalgia, and sometimes with disbelief that it was allowed to operate at all. But it did, for nearly 2 decades. Action Park wasn't destroyed by a hurricane. It wasn't abandoned to rust. It didn't freeze in time. It closed because the world around it changed, because the tolerance for risk narrowed, because lawsuits and regulation eventually caught up. It became a cautionary tale, a legend, a punchline, and a piece of American amusement history that could likely never exist again. The rides were loud, the crowds were chaotic, the injuries were real. And for better or worse, Action Park became proof that not all thrills are sustainable. Some parks fade quietly, some are dismantled. Action Park burned bright and burned out. The question it leaves behind is simple. If it opened today, exactly as it was in 1978, would anyone allow it to stay open for even one summer? Let me know in the comments what you think. And if you want more stories about places where history refuses to stay buried, check out these videos next. Thanks for watching.